Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. Today, I am moderating a debate between Ken Olson and James Valliant. Ken Olson believes that the Testimonium Flavianum is a complete interpolation and that Josephus never mentioned Jesus. But James over here thinks that Josephus did actually mention Jesus and is extremely skeptical on rather if we can be certain if the testimony was interpolated at all. So, Ken, I give you the floor, 10-minute introduction argument, followed by James.
Okay, let me start with probably people watching your channel already know what the Testimonium Flavianum is, but just in case, we'll go over that this is a passage about Jesus Christ that occurs in the extant manuscripts of Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Chapter 3. All right. You see, Josephus was a Jewish historian, and there is a passage about Jesus in his works. If it's authentic and Josephus really wrote it, then this is testimony about Jesus from a first century witness. Josephus wrote the Antiquities or published the Antiquities around the year 93, 94 CE. And he'd be the only non-Christian witness we have from the first century if this were authentic. Now, this was generally taken to be authentic until basically the Protestant Reformation. No one quotes it, no Christian quotes it until the time of Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century, who quotes it 3 times in 3 different works that he wrote. Okay, before that, Christians occasionally know of Josephus and mention him, but nobody knows about this particular passage. And around the time of the Reformation, somebody first caught on, and I should qualify that. This is the time when Christians began to doubt the passage. Before that, we know there were Jews that had doubted the authenticity of this passage. It's just that since we only get the Jewish opinion through Christians talking about it, we're not quite sure on what basis the Jews who did not accept the authenticity of the passage. We're not sure why they didn't accept it. But Lucas Osiander in around 1600 looked at the passage and said, it sounds like a Christian passage. It sounds like the work of a Christian. And other than this passage, Josephus, he has 30 books that we have, and this is pretty much it. All of a sudden, he's been talking about Moses and the law and the great constitution given by Moses. There's no sign that he's anything other than an Orthodox Jew until all of a sudden it breaks forward and he says, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if one should call him a man, for he was a maker of miraculous works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure, and he won over both many of the Jews and many of the Greeks. This one was the Christ. And when, on the testimony of the principal men among us, Pilate had him condemned to the cross, those who adhered to him at first did not stop adhering to him. Presumably, you have to supply that. For he appeared to them alive again on the 3rd day, this and myriads of other things as the prophets foretold. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has to this day not dwindled. Some have it died out, but I think dwindled is more the gist of it. Now, since Lucas Osiander wrote it, scholars have become increasingly convinced that it cannot, as a whole, be attributed to Josephus. It says he was the Christ, he was the Messiah. It says that he arose from the dead again after his death, and that had been foretold about him by the prophets. Okay, this is kind of a giveaway that this is a Christian writing, unless we accept that Josephus was in general a Christian, which we wouldn't gather from the rest of what he wrote. Then this was interpolated. So I started looking at, if it's interpolated, who did it? Who could have done it? Who had method, motive, and opportunity? And I looked at it and like, well, you know, Eusebius is the first person that knows about this passage. So that would be where we start looking. If someone interpolated it, it could have been no later than that. You occasionally hear people saying something like, oh, it's interpolated in the Middle Ages. No, that's not possible. Eusebius knows about this in the early 4th century. It couldn't have been interpolated later than Eusebius. Okay, it was Eusebius or someone before Eusebius, and nobody before him knows about the passage, and nobody points to it as, you know, this would be a helpful passage for Christians. And Eusebius does it 3 times. So then I started looking at all the arguments that people use when they want to argue that it's authentic and say, oh, well, a Christian wouldn't have said X, Y, and Z. And I started looking through the works of Eusebius. Are they right when they say that? This is just people sitting around thinking, well, you know, that doesn't sound like a Christian to me. And I look, well, what if Eusebius did say those things? And the first was maker of miraculous works. In Greek, it's paradoxon ergon poietes. And people said, well, a Christian wouldn't have said that. It sounds like Jesus is just a wonder worker. And when I looked, no, Josephus never uses poietes in the sense of somebody who makes or does something. This occurs in Eusebius 11 times of Jesus or God, right? So this would actually count the other way. Paradoxon ergon poietes is Josephus. There are other things. The Christian wouldn't have used the word pleasure. Pleasure had negative connotation. I looked at Eusebius and no, when there's a bad kind of pleasure, it's usually modified by a form of the word sarx. There are fleshly pleasures, and those are bad. But there are good pleasures. He praises martyrs who receive death with pleasure. And in his commentary on the Psalms, he says that the dead exult in pleasure in the divine presence. The dead are with God, and that's pleasurable. So a lot of these things, Tribe of Christians is another one that people say, oh, well, you know, a Christian just wouldn't have said these things about Jesus. I just think, well, no, you're not really looking. You're starting with an idea of what you think a Christian ought to have said, rather than let's look at Eusebius and see what he does said. So basically my work has been to look for these things in Eusebius, and if he said this, what would it mean? Can we find parallels for this language in Eusebius, and how does he use it? And then look at the Testimonium Flavianum again and see if it's plausible to think he wrote the entire thing. And I think it is. All right, how much time have I used?
Keep going, please.
6 minutes. 6 minutes and 32 seconds.
I've used 6 minutes. Okay, so I think there are 3 points that have to be looked at here that convince me that Eusebius is most likely. This is ancient history. We're never certain of anything. Okay, particularly ancient literary history. It's hard to be certain. 3 things that make it look to me like Eusebius wrote it. First of all, that thing about the prophets ever being foretold these and many other things. Well, who foretold that the Messiah would be a maker of miraculous works, would win over not only Jews, which other Jewish prophets had done, but also Greeks, and that he would teach the true things, and I might have to get into what that means, to everybody, both Jews and Greeks. And you look, well, it's Eusebius that says that, right? Eusebius thinks those are things the Messiah has foretold. Secondly, when he says that people continued to adhere to him after his death, that it's because he appeared to them alive again. And twice Eusebius ranks this as reasons for the resurrection. I think it's once he ranks it first and once he ranks it about fourth. But the reason for the resurrection was to convince the disciples and people that listened to his teachings that his teaching about the resurrection was true. He had to appear to them to convince them that the resurrection was a fact. He did that. And the third thing is that tribe of Christians. Well, scholars have wondered, well, why call Christians a tribe? Like, why are they not Jews? Did Josephus think they weren't Jews? And I think this is a Eusebianism. He thinks the Christians are, in fact, a new nation. They're distinct from the Jews and from the Greeks. They're not Jews or Greeks. They're a new nation called after Jesus. And what defines them? Well, what defines them is that they accepted the truth. Jews and Greeks haven't, but Christians have. They are the nation that has accepted the truth. Okay, I'll wrap up there.
James, 10 minutes.
Well, I think that, you know, you make several fascinating points, Ken, there that have to be addressed specifically. if we believe, and I'll start with this position, although I don't think it's my current position, but if we believe there was modification, if it was merely interpolated, then how do we know what the original citation actually said? And if we don't know that, and if we accept the idea that it's been modified, then why couldn't these various modifications have simply come from the Eusebian era as opposed to the entire passage? Why do we reject the entire testimonium? And there it seems, since we have lots of Josephus manuscripts, and our Josephus manuscripts all appear to basically boil down to these one that Eusebius is using. There's Agapius, Jerome has 2 different versions of it, and so forth. And although we have some indication that there are different manuscripts, there's really good reason to believe that they all of our extant, for Josephus, we've got a relatively large number of manuscripts, and they all seem to possess some kind of reference to Jesus in Book 18 of the Antiquities. So while you give me good reason to doubt certain words and elements, you've so far not given me a sufficient reason. And I do believe that the laboring or the burden of proof is on you, given the manuscript evidence as we have it. And given that fact, and given the fact that Origen is certain, and he's writing before Eusebius, and though he does not quote the testimony, certainly not as we have it. And although it would be hard, since we don't, if there was a modification, it would be hard to reconstruct what Origen was looking at, whatever he was looking at, because we don't have the original if it was tampered with. And given that, Eusebius is quoting Origen, Eusebius seems to be very much in line with Origen's view on these things. And he doesn't see, and reading Origen, he doesn't seem to have a problem at all with that being consistent with the testimonium as he's giving it. I find it odd that if Josephus constructed the entire thing from scratch, that he would not have, that Eusebius would not have inserted that in the wars, which actually he uses more. I'm not certain that Eusebius is rhetorically using the testimonium in the doctrinal way that he really could have used it. He could have used the testimonium in various powerful doctrinal ways that he simply does not. Suggesting and besides, the value to Eusebius and Origen of Josephus as a witness is that he's a Jew. He's not a Christian. And for Eusebius to have done this would make it sound as though Eusebius is turning Josephus into a Christian. Something he does not want to do and doesn't need to do, given the way he uses Josephus, it seems to me. Although there is language that seems to support debates in Eusebian time, Eusebius uses certain language quite a bit, it still doesn't establish the causal connection between the language. That is to say, the concerns of Eusebius may be framed in that very language precisely because Eusebius does use a testimonium that uses that language. So while there may be a connection in the language, it doesn't demonstrate the causal order of influence. That is to say, Eusebius may have been, since he cites it in 3 different works, Eusebius, although not to the extent you'd think he would had he invented this incredible passage. And finally, I would note that the current translator of Josephus, Mason, he accepts the testimonium full on. He points out that the was the Christ might be, as well as the statement that Vespasian, the suggestion that he doesn't completely buy that Josephus is saying Vespasian was called the Messiah. But when we take into account both the assertion that Vespasian is the Messiah in conjunction with what Steve Mason has suggested, it may not be an assertion that contradicts Origen at all. And if that's the case, furthermore, I'd throw into this mix the recent work of Ulrich Victor. He actually makes a fascinating claim. Now, to me, I have to rely I read Greek, but I do not, at his level, I have to say it's above my pay grade. He looks at it in idiomatic Greek and compares Josephus's Antiquities with all the bells and whistles as Eusebius quotes it, and says, it could have been written in a neutral or even in some sense negative sense. Every passage there, and he was a wise guy, and people who were suckers were taken in by him and read in idiomatic Greek. The Antiquities may not be the glorious flowery pro-Christian thing that it appears to be that causes people to be suspicious. And finally, what I would say is that that in itself is not sufficient reason. Thinking that Josephus must have said something because that's what Josephus must have said is the wrong way to approach ancient texts. We cannot use assumptions about what we think Josephus would have said. It is the text itself that must inform us as to what Josephus said. And then until and unless we have positive reason to believe in the interpolation, damn good reason to think this was interpolated, and we have reason to believe that, I say we go with the manuscript as is, or no, and for purposes of this debate, I'll go no further than saying it was interpolated, added to, enhanced, but that there was some reference. And the James passage, and I know you have an argument about the James passage, but the James passage in the Antiquities does seem to suggest there was another reference, an earlier reference to a Christ of some kind, whatever that reference is. But it just seems to me that Josephus would, or Eusebius would have inserted this in the war, and he would have used it far more extensively than he actually does use it.
Okay,
Can Olson,
I
10
respond to
minutes.
that now? Okay.
Yeah, 10 minutes.
So we'll start with a burden of proof argument. Once we accept it's interpolated, we're talking about two different hands in the category within this passage, right? Pretty much everybody agrees where this passage begins and ends. And we're talking about, was it Josephus or was it the interpolator that's writing each part? And I think the burden of proof is, once we accept that it has been interpolated, the burden of proof is equally on either side to establish who wrote it out of the two authors we know to be active there. The burden of proof is equal, and I think I can give a compelling account for parts of it, and no one can give a compelling account for some of it not being Eusebian. So that's point number one. Secondly, about the manuscripts, we don't have lots of manuscripts. For books 18 through 20 of the Antiquities, we have 10 manuscripts in Greek. We have 10. Now, only 3 of those are actually used for critical editions because with standard text critical procedure, once you know that 7 were copied from the other 3, you don't need to look at the 7, you just look at the 3, right? A copy is not going to be more accurate than the thing it was copied from. So it comes down to there are 3. The earliest is from the 11th century. Okay, so we don't have early manuscripts and we don't have lots of them. And then we have Latin manuscripts. Okay. The problem with using the Latin manuscripts as a witness to the Testimonium Flavianum is that the Latin translation is not made originally from manuscript of Josephus. The Latin translation that appears in our Latin manuscripts of the Latin translation of the Antiquities was taken from Rufinus' translation of Eusebius' ecclesiastical history. So the Eusebian version, however it got there, whether Eusebius wrote it or not, is what we have in our manuscripts of the Latin Antiquities. Eusebius is there. Okay, that's the manuscript issue. The burden of proof issue. Okay, why not in the wars? Well, I don't know why it would be in the wars. The Antiquities is the one that deals with more of the time leading up to the wars rather than the war itself. There's a more extensive treatment of Pilate. We have John the Baptist in that. I think it would be much more likely to put it in the Antiquities. We do have one very late manuscript of the wars where it looks like somebody started to interpolate the Testimonium Flavianum in the Antiquities. This is in Robert Eisler's book. He's got some beautiful photo plates of this Vossianus manuscript, but somebody started to interpolate it into the wars and decided not to. It's sort of written in and then sort of crossed out. So I don't know why we should think it would be in the war instead of the Antiquities. Having to do with the word Messiah or Christos, no, the word Christos in Greek, meaning anointed or anointed one, it's only the twice in the Testimonium Flavianum and the James passage. Josephus does not use that word any other time, if he used it those times at all, which I'm suggesting he doesn't. He never calls Vespasian the Messiah. He says there was a prophecy about a ruler that would arise in the east, and he thought this applied to Vespasian. He doesn't call him Christ. Interestingly enough, he avoids the word Christ probably because his Greco-Roman audience just wouldn't have known that was. What does this mean? The oily guy, right? That he would have had to explain the term. Most notably where he goes over Samuel anointing David, he says, make him king, right? He's got the word king there, and he uses the verb for putting oil on him. But then he says, he put oil on him and made him king, but he doesn't use that noun Christos of David. And presumably, again, it's because in normal Greeks, Jews would know it because it's in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, but most Greco-Roman readers would not have known what that word means. So yeah, it's only there in the Antiquities 1863-64 and then Antiquities 2020 in reference to James. Those are the only places. Let's see. Right, I agree with James completely that we can't rely on what Josephus must have said, but then I think that counts equally against him as on me. There's a big argument. There's an argument that, well, Jesus was this important guy. Josephus must have said something about him, right? No, we don't know that he was that important. He doesn't say anything about Hillel, the founder of the rabbinic movement. He can leave that out. It seems reasonable he might have not mentioned Jesus either. We think of Jesus as really important because of the effect he has had on our time, but I don't know that a first century historian would have found him all that important. All right, and we're probably going to have a long discussion of the James passage, so I'll stop there. And
James, 10 minutes counterable.
It is a distinct term that Josephus uses, but Josephus does make plain that the early Jewish kings were anointed. And he does enhance his Vespasian as the Messiah thing. He tells us that the whole cause of the war was the widespread Jewish belief among the rebels that the Messiah would come right now. And of course, the prophecies that they were pointing to are actually pointing to Vespasian. He gives that substance by telling us, and reports with credibility even, the vision of armies seen fighting in the clouds over the siege of Jerusalem. Now that is actually to cite Daniel's Son of Man prophecy, and it can only apply to his own messianic claims about Vespasian. Although he doesn't use the term Christ, it's quite obvious he's talking about the same messianic prophecies that motivated all of the rebels, all the false messiahs of the first century, only this time genuinely applying to the Flavian emperor. And he gives it prophetic substance by saying that the Son of Man prophecy, the glorious coming of the Son of Man, did in fact happen with the siege of Jerusalem. Therefore, the glorious coming of the Son of Man is demonstration of his proof, in effect, that Vespasian's the Messiah. So he is, in my view, it's pretty clear that Vespasian is meaning us and giving prophetic substance to what he's saying. And more than that, it is a special title for Jesus that would be used uniquely in the Antiquities. But that's what makes, as you said, that's what makes the interesting interplay between the James and Jesus passages so interesting. For if he had used the word Christ in the James passage, that would imply that he had some other description or explanation of this person who at least had this title, even if the title was unknown to his pagan audience. He might well use titles that are not totally familiar to his pagan audience, but he himself in the Antiquities makes plain that the early kings of Israel and Judea were anointed. Anointed ones. And he makes plain that Vespasian is the fulfillment of Daniel, no less. Maybe Titus is. Furthermore, while we do have a limited number, though, all you're saying is that our manuscripts are limited to the ones we have, that you have no real manuscript evidence of a Josephus that doesn't contain this.
Right. We have no real manuscript evidence for Josephus before Eusebius at all whatsoever.
Right. So our only manuscript evidence is that it contains this. So until we have a reason to remove all of it, and I would have to say that, yeah, to remove all of it, because it's much more likely to have been enhanced for its purposes had there been some neutral negative reference or something. That's what would piss Origen off. And let's get to the James passage after all. If, the James passage, which identifies James in its initial identification as the brother of the aforementioned or so-called Christ, it just absolutely doesn't make any sense to me, whatever, to reconstruct that passage or to suggest that there isn't something neutral about that. But in any event, had Origen not been reading Josephus, had Origen misstated what he was reading, then I'd have no reason to believe in an interpolation at all in the first instance. without assuming what Josephus himself must have, quote, must have believed. So setting aside the Josephus must have believed X, Y, and Z arguments, absent Origen, I see no positive reason to believe that it was even interpolated. If we believe Origen was accurately reading Josephus, then and only then do we really have solid reason, given the manuscript evidence that we have. You just reflected, we have no manuscript that doesn't have a Jesus reference in the Antiquities. Given that, that zero evidence of such a manuscript of Josephus not mentioning him, my only evidence for interpolation actually boils down to Origen, unless I'm going to make a circular argument about what Josephus, quote, must have said.
Okay, let's begin with the circularity part. No, Origen, I think, could be wrong and is wrong, and you might not accept that, but I do. The thing you're calling circular is we have 30 books of Josephus. We can read those, and we can make good inferences about what the things he believes are, and we can compare them to what's in this passage and compare this passage to what's in Eusebius, right?
Josephus shares a lot of Christian values and ideas and attitudes.
As do Jews.
Across the board, he may not believe in, he may not be a poor man, but he thinks holding property in common and poverty is the peak of virtue. He thinks that celibacy, he's certainly not a celibate himself, but he thinks that's wonderfully virtuous. You can go right down, he minimizes the role of the circumcision in the covenant when he describes Abraham, the story of Abraham. Again and again, he's against forced circumcision. He appears to have a Pauline view of circumcision. And again and again and again, he has a highly Hellenized, similar to the New Testament, approach on many basic issues. He believes that God has gone over to the side of the Romans, just as Romans 13 does with Paul. He believes that, he can't honestly be a Torah Orthodox and believe that Vespasian is the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. He has to be true with what he says when he criticizes circumcision in the Vita. So he's not a big fan of circumcision. He disconnects it from the covenant when he describes Abraham. And so he, like Paul, is stepping away from Torah Orthodoxy pretty clearly, and still admiring ideas of the Essenes like celibacy and poverty and shared communal property as the highest virtue. In many ways, he endorses the love commandments. And the other thing is, if the John passage is correct, and if, as most scholars believe, the James passage is correct, then what we have is Josephus whitewashing two of the major protagonists of the New Testament. Normally, these rebels are bad guys for Josephus. They're innovators, they're madmen, etc., etc. But somehow these apocalyptic preachers like John the Baptist and James, who I believe is connected to Christianity because I think it's an authentic passage mentioned to Christ. Why is Josephus whitewashing John the Baptist and James the Just? It seems to me that we might expect an equally positive passage about Jesus, for he seems to be whitewashing the very characters that would be relevant to Christians. So I have nothing in Josephus that would tell me that, other than assumptions about things, that would tell me that it's anti-Christian, other than his assertion that Vespasian is the Messiah.
Well, anytime that we interpret a literary work, we are using assumptions about things to do.
Yeah,
that's the way it is. You might think your assumptions are better than mine. I might disagree.
But they are just assumptions.
The whitewashing
ancient texts, and we're doing our best to infer from.
The whitewashing part. I don't know that James has been whitewashed. There's nothing positive about James in Antiquities 2200.
He thought it was unjust. His execution was unjust.
Yeah, but because it was irregular, that the high priest didn't have the authority to call together a Sanhedrin of judges and to put people to death. There's nothing about the character of James in there or what anybody thought about him.
Well, the good people thought it was a bad thing.
The good people thought the procedure was a bad thing.
Right. And so all we have is the Sanhedrin did something that was not cricket, and even the Roman, they had to wait for the Romans to be gone to get away with this. And so when the Roman governor came, he changed it. Okay, so what they're saying in effect is naughty, Josephus is implying naughty Ananias for killing James. These good people knew it was unjust. No, it's a whitewash of whatever execution this was. It's not a, hey, yeah, great, James is executed. You cannot argue that. That's absurd. If anything, it's a whitewash, because it doesn't tell us any real crime that he committed. All it does is say good people thought it was a bad thing. That's a whitewash.
So you're suggesting he did commit a crime for which he was executed?
I would suggest probably that James was an actual rebel. And that's why the Sanhedrin wanted him gone.
I might agree. I might very well agree with you on that.
Okay.
Right. I don't know that this James was the brother of Christ. He might.
Right.
The situation is that there were these governors that had to okay executions, and there were people that were criminals that were being held. This is in Antiquities.
Careful about that. Josephus sends many letters from Roman authorities giving Jewish Sanhedrin the authority to enforce Mosaic law. But this appears to be a unique sort of situation with James. James appears to be a especially sensitive person that the Romans would be delicate about executing. It is not, we're not told in this passage that the Sanhedrin lacked all authority. What we're being told is that it was irregular. The governor was away, and since the governor was away, they took advantage of this opportunity. The implication is not that the Sanhedrin lacked any authority to enforce Mosaic law. Josephus explains that they did earlier.
In general, the Romans kept the authority to have people actually put to death. Capital punishment was reserved for the governor. What I'm saying is the Sanhedrin did not have the power to do that. During an interim,
where the Sanhedrin has this authority.
What?
Josephus cites letters from the Roman authorities indicating that the Sanhedrin actually had the power to execute people for the Mosaic law. And it's pretty clear that the Sanhedrin had such authority. There's all kinds of informal tradition that suggests just exactly that.
James, so your 10 minutes rebuttal is up. Let's give 10 minutes full on to Ken Olson to give his entire argument about the James passage.
About James.
I want to hear this.
For those of you who have watched my earlier video with Jacob, you've probably already heard this. What I think happened in the James passage was that there was this person named James that was put to death, and he wasn't at that time identified as the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. I think that's Origen's language. When Origen, that went from Origen to Eusebius and was interpolated into the Antiquities based on what Eusebius had written. Now, the way this works is, well, first of all, who is called Christ? Now, if we think that Greco-Roman readers would have known what Christ meant, then we don't really need an earlier passage about Jesus, right? And I gave the example of Pallas and his brother in the wars, that Josephus refers to somebody as this person's brother, and he never bothers to explain who that person was. Just that person was a freedman of Augustus, and everybody would have known that, all right? So if Jesus is a very famous person and everybody knows who this Christ is, then it doesn't really need a prior passage. Only if this needs to be explained to people, do we need an earlier passage? All right. But I don't think that Josephus actually just said who is called Christ, because there's nothing doubtful about that. It's frequently suggested that it's translated as the alleged Christ, and the word legomenos does not have that sense in Josephus' works. He means with the name Christ. And if that's what Josephus wrote, then he must mean this person that you Greco-Romans have heard of called Christos. He could not mean that we Jews called Christ, because Jews don't refer to Jesus, or non-Christian Jews just don't do that. And I saw in the comments on the earlier video, someone asked, how do we know that? It's in Josephus's later works, the Contra Appionum and the Life of Jesus, where he talks about his Jewish readers and how they reacted to his earlier works. So in book 1 of each of those, we have a passage where he says, King Agrippa and a number of people who served in the war, read the war and approved of my work. We know he has a Jewish audience, or at least we know it in as far as Josephus claims that his works were widely read among the Jewish elite. He could be making it all up, okay? That's possible, but I'm inclined to think that even if he's exaggerating, at least, he thinks that Jews are reading my work. Okay, so we've got this James passage, and we've got this peculiar thing, who is called the Messiah. And Jewish readers would have known what that word meant. Jews who read Greeks knew the Messiah meant the Christ, and they probably would have, what are you talking about, Josephus? What do you mean this guy who's called the Messiah? We don't call him the Messiah. Right? He would have had to have been saying it for the benefit of his Gentile readers who would have heard, you've heard about this Christ guy, you might not know who that was. This is that Christ guy you've been hearing about. Now, to get to the Origen passage, I am one of those people, starting with Henry St. James Thackeray, but a number of people, Henry Chadwick, John Painter, Steve Mason, who thinks that Origen has in fact gotten confused, and he's referring to this Hegesippus passage that does in fact say that the temple was destroyed. Well, it suggests that the temple was destroyed because of the murder of James.
Any more than the Josephus passage?
Sorry. Oh, so, yeah, very much more. First, in the passage that we actually have in Josephus, there is nothing about James being righteous or what anybody thought about James. We don't get that. In the Hegesippus passage, we are given the word righteous, dikaios, is applied to James 11 times, and we're told this is something that people thought. So that's something that's in Hegesippus, and it's in Origen, and it's not in Josephus.
Well, we have other attestation that James is called the just. The interesting part to me is the cause of the war thing. It's neither in Josephus nor Hegesippus.
It's the cause of the siege of Jerusalem and the capture of the city.
We don't have the full. Well, first of all, Eusebius quotes both the Testimonium and Hegesippus. In fact, Eusebius is our source for this Hegesippus, and Eusebius is kind enough to tell us that this is the whole of the James bit from Hegesippus. So he quotes Hegesippus. He quotes the Testimonium with all the bells and whistles as we have it, and that's still not a problem for Eusebius. So Eusebius would be making the same error as Origen, even though he has all these manuscripts in front of him. That seems to me unlikely. Furthermore, none of the details that are unique to Hegesippus are found in Origen's description. No foolish club, etc. And neither Hegesippus nor Josephus, as we have it, have this causal argument about James causing the war, which Origen ascribes to him. So either Origen is messed up completely, but I have no reason to believe independently that it's Hegesippus itself. Hegesippus is simply the most convenient other person to land on, and I don't see any reason, since Eusebius has got, and he's our source for that Hegesippus passage, and he's got the Testimonium with all the bells and whistles, and he's a familiar with and a supporter of Origen. See, if your Origen were to make up this entire Testimonium, it would be, in effect, contradicting Origen. He wouldn't want to do that. The whole value of Josephus to Eusebius is that he's a Jewish independent witness. To have made up this passage, as you point out, would in fact imply that he was an Orthodox Christian. If that's the case, then Eusebius would not positively have so contradicted Origen as say, well, Origen's all wrong on this. And now, let me tell you, Origen's a great guy, but let me quote the Testimonium with all the bells and whistles. Let me quote Hegesippus and somehow still be confusing it like Origen was. It makes no sense to me.
But it does make sense to me, and this is why. He reads in Origen that there is such a passage, and he writes in the ecclesiastical history, here's what Josephus said, and then he takes what Origen had said in indirect discourse, and he says Josephus said it. He's never seen this in Josephus. He doesn't tell us where in Josephus it might be found, but he quotes what Origen says and Josephus says it. This is because he thinks Origen is accurate. Then he looks at the passage, and he can't tell where that passage that he's just said from Origen occurs, anywhere in the... This is unusual, okay? The Testimonium Flavianum, it's in book 18. The James passage is in book 20. He doesn't know where this passage that he's gotten from Origen is found in the works of Josephus.
He doesn't, as he often does. Right.
Okay, so he doesn't know. And this is one thing where you might, this is not just my opinion. This is Thackeray, Steve Painter, Henry Chadwick. They all think we're getting this passage from Origen. Now, then he quotes the passage as we know it from Antiquities 2200. But I think he's taken that identification, brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, from Origen, and he's looked in his copy of the Antiquities, and he says, I can't find this passage Origen is talking about. That he just quoted and hasn't located. But he finds, well, there is this guy James who's put to death here. That must be the same guy.
He is a classic Josephine argument. One could see Origen because Josephus is constantly giving us various causes for the war. It was the stopping of the sacrifices for the Romans. It was this guy, Justus of Tiberias. It was the prophecies. It was Judas the Galilean. And giving that kind of causal argument is classic Josephus. I could imagine Origen inferring such an or making a mistake and importing that classic Josephine type of argument. It was Justus of Tiberias, or it was the Hebrew prophecies, or it was Judas the Galilean, or it was the stopping of the sacrifice. It's a classic. Josephus gives us multiple causes for the war, and in that context, it being sort of a classic Josephine argument, one could easily imagine someone like Origen imputing it to Josephus, and someone like Eusebius still just going with that imputation. And when you line it up to the dates, I mean, here it is. The war breaks out in 66, and James gets executed in 62. One could sort of say, given the way Josephus argues, and given the ball from that point is rolling straight down the hill toward open rebellion, one could just infer that that's what Josephus is saying, given Josephus's style of argumentation.
Okay, sorry, Jacob, I want to interrupt for just a moment and say, I'm not just doing all of this off the top of my head. I want to give a shout out to my paper, Eusebian reading of the Testimonium Flavianum, which if you Google my name in Eusebian reading, you'll find it on Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies page. You can read the whole article where I document stuff. The second thing, I have a blog entry that's at Ken Olson's blog, oneword.wordpress.com, on why Origen said Josephus was unbelieving in Jesus as the Christ. So you can look at the reasons I give for that there. And basically, he thinks all Jews are unbelieving as a Christ. This is a statement. He uses that word aposton about Jews in general. And Origen has read Josephus, and he's assumed he's an unbelieving Jew. That's why he says it. It's not that there was some particular passage where Origen specifically said, I do not believe in Jesus as the Christ. It's because he's an aposton, one of the unbelieving Jews that hasn't said that he believes in Jesus as the Christ. Okay, getting to the next part, the classic Josephine argument. Yeah, there are lots of reasons, and there's one that's really interesting in Jewish War 4, which is about Ananus, the man who had James put to death in Antiquities 2200. He was a former high priest, and he was a leader of the Jews in Jerusalem during the siege. And then he's killed by the mob. And what Josephus writes about him is, I should not mistake if I said that the death of Ananus was the beginning of the destruction of the city, and that from this very day may be dated the overthrow of her wall and the ruin of her affairs, whereon they saw their high priest and the procurer of their preservation slain in the midst of their city. He was on other accounts also a venerable and a very just man. And that's that word dikaios. It's not applied to James anywhere. It is applied to Ananus here. It's in the superlative form, dikaiotatos. Okay.
What that means,
besides the grandeur of that mobility and the dignity and the honor of which we possessed, he had been okay, it goes on about the virtue.
What it does is it gives us great grounds to believe that the argument is being made about James. If Ananias, the guy, is killed, and look, the logic is really simple here. If Ananias' death is a causal feature to the war, and if they killed him, why did they kill? Why did the rebels kill? Well, maybe because he was an enemy of James. It's connected to his execution of James. That can't be ignored. So, and the mere fact that Josephus is calling one of these establishment priests a good guy does not mean that he can't do a bad thing.
Okay, James, you can give your 10 minutes full argument on the James passage.
If the argument is that the later Jesus, son of Damnius, mentioned as the next high priest appointed, is the James to whom is the Jesus to whom James is the brother, and so that therefore begins by identifying in the James passage James, the brother of the Jesus, son of Damnius, as opposed to the so-called Christ, then that would be unprecedented in Josephus. He would not repeat the modifier that would identify this unless he introduced another guy named Jesus in between time, which he does not. The son of Damnius would be used only once, and he'd only need to refer to it only once.
Sorry, James, may I interrupt you just once here? I am
Sure.
not arguing for Richard Carrier's version of about the James passage.
I wanted to
Sorry.
get that out of the way. I think that version of it is an awkward reconstruction and doesn't make sense to me, frankly. On the other hand, if we're saying that Christ was the part, and maybe it could have been another Jesus, it's still awkward to identify someone as their brother. You're right. There are occasions where Josephus will say, for example, this guy Felix, he's the brother of an important Roman freedman. Well, it's so important. He's one of the men who his brother helps run the empire for Claudius and then for a while under Nero. That brother is so well known, as you pointed out. There doesn't appear to me that you're being consistent. Or if Jesus Christ is well known, we would need some elaboration on the Christ, or do we need it? You're right. There'd be elite Jews who'd probably be familiar, or very familiar with it, but most pagans probably wouldn't be familiar with it as a term. So, but it just seems to me that it does imply that it's by his brother, this famous brother, so that if he doesn't have a famous brother elsewhere mentioned, it is a strange way to identify a person right off the bat as James, the brother of this other Jesus. How would I know who the heck this other Jesus is, absent some other mention? And if you're doing the unusual thing comparatively, not son of, not office, he's the brother of, then he better be like the brother of Pallas, Felix, who was appointed governor of Judea. Then he better have a brother that we know so well, or has been previously identified in Josephus as a very important person. Then it better be like the relationship between Nero's freedman and his brother, the governor Felix. That would suggest an extremely important person, Jesus Christ, that everyone sort of knows and takes for granted, like this right-hand man of Claudius and Nero.
James, we got a super chat here from Donnie Springer. Thank you for the $5. How do you account for Origen's lack of citation or commentary on the TF, despite being a prolific Christian writer and given his commentary on James?
I don't think that Christians before Origen were much interested in such. I think Origen was by far the most historically minded when it came to these kind of things of our early Christian writers. It's about this time when interest in independent Jewish testimony is clicking in. I think that Josephus is used, but the point is that they just assume that it's not as though they have a debate over historicity. I mean, there is an argument, but they don't need Josephus in effect for this purpose. It's not that they have their own writings, they have their own tradition. And that's what they're basing it on. They don't need to cite what they think pretty early on is an independent Jewish witness. He says Vespasian's the Messiah, or implies that Vespasian's the Messiah. Isn't he a Jew? And so they would pretty much ignore Josephus for all the reasons that Origen is pissed off. He's not an enthusiastic Christian. And that would be sufficient, it seems to me, to explain a lack of using Josephus. They don't need Josephus to bolster their belief. They've got their own texts and revelations and authority structure that tells them about Jesus.
Okay, you want to finish what you were saying about James?
It just seems to me that it's not a good thing that's happened here. Josephus has clearly indicated that the way you would know this James is through his brother, presumably his brother who's got a name Jesus. If it's not the Jesus Christ that is elsewhere mentioned in Antiquities, it's hard for me to understand that passage at all. Furthermore, it is a bad thing that's happening. Josephus is not reporting this as, oh, yay, James is dead, which is what you'd expect if Ken's right. There's no great enthusiasm for this. It's not a good thing. And there's also changes, by the way, between Wars and Antiquities on personalities and groups. He kind of switches whether it's the Pharisees or the Essenes who are most like the Stoics and Greek philosophers. Josephus's changes between Antiquities and Wars are a fascinating study in themselves, but there are significant changes and differences. And one might well be the generalized portrait of Ananias here. But the point is that if Ananias was done in by the rebels, let me suggest we have to explain that. The best way to explain that is a rebel sympathizer like James was done in by Ananias earlier, which would create the causal argument that Origen says is there.
Are you ending your 10 minutes early?
I'm ending my 10 minutes right there because I don't see any reason why saying Ananias's death was a proximate cause and then telling me Ananias was the guy who killed this James is not, when you put those two things together, a source for Origen being able to positively say Josephus is arguing the death of James that just people thought was so awful was the cause of this.
Okay, Ken, 10 minutes for counter rebuttal.
Okay. First of all, having to do with the title Christos, that it would have to have been explained earlier. Well, the Testimonium Flavianum doesn't explain the title. Okay. For Eusebius, like he quotes it in the Demonstratio and in the Historia Ecclesiastica, and anybody who read his works up to that point would know what the Christ is because he's been talking about it extensively. The same is not true for the works of Josephus. Like when it comes in the Testimonium, it's this brand new word, and he doesn't say what it actually means.
Well, if we don't have the original text, how do we know that? Besides, there is in the existing text some explanation of that. That it's the prophets were the ones who would explain what this Christ thing is, and he did these wonderful things and risen on the third day, just as the prophets said. And I wanted to go back to that for a second, because the Christian literature itself, although they're oftentimes not related to the third day resurrection, the Christian literature itself claims that there's Hebrew literature basis for this, the sign of Jonah, 3 days in the whale, and so forth, the 3 days elsewhere, that these are all certainly metaphors for the 3 days that Jesus spent in the ground. So if Josephus agrees that the sign of Jonah, which we have, incidentally, good reason to believe that Messianic Jews before the war were thinking the Jonah prophecy was somehow messianically connected. The Gabriel inscription is a famous example of that. But we have, if the Gabriel inscription is accurate, then it's clear that the Jonah 3 days in the whale part is connected to Messianic ideology, but in rebellious Jewish minds. For Josephus, the third day resurrection.
But I get a point of clarification. You're saying then that it's reasonable for Josephus to have said that Messianic prophecy applied to Jesus because he was in fact a Christian that accepted that? That this is just a report?
I'm going to leave it for the moment. I'm becoming more and more convinced that the Testimonium doesn't need to have been interpolated at all. And I'm growing more and more conservative. Reading Origen, I have traditionally been of the view that it was at least modified, but that Origen was reading about someone. It wouldn't make any sense for Origen to say Jesus wasn't the Christ in Josephus if Jesus hadn't been mentioned in Josephus. So Origen thinks Jesus is mentioned in Josephus.
Sorry, he doesn't say. There is no statement in Origen that Josephus said Jesus was not the Christ. He's referring to Origen is referring to Josephus as unbelieving in Jesus as the Christ. He believes he's one of the large class of unbelieving Jews, not that he particularly made a statement saying that.
Well, not brother of Christ. So Josephus knows that there's this James, brother of Christ, I say, and there's no real reason to substitute Christ for some other term. So that's not a problem. I don't see the problem. In other words, unless we assume what Josephus must have said, I see no reason to do this at all. Origen says that James is this brother of Christ. So Origen believes that Josephus mentioned Christ, or that his reference to the James passage makes zero sense. He could not have identified that James as his James. If the Josephus Origen was reading had no connection between James and Jesus called the Christ, then there'd be no reason for Origen to mention it as saying, well, he should have said it was Jesus's death that caused the war, not James's. No, it's obvious. The Origen believed that Jesus was in Josephus. If he didn't, it would make zero sense.
Okay, unless he's confused it with Hegesippus, who does talk about James, and he's confused.
No reason to believe he did.
Okay, you don't think he did, and then you say there are these details that are missing, but you're ignoring the details that are there, which is it refers to
no unique details from Hegesippus in Origen.
The righteous, and that the people thought he was righteous 11 times. And then he does connect the death of James to the destruction of the temple. Okay.
Origen's use of the just one is perfectly explicable with the fact that we don't need Hegesippus to associate James with the Just One. We have the pseudo-Clementine literature and all kinds of other material telling
Where
us.
does it say what the people had thought about him? Pseudo-Clementine literature is much later.
Oh, okay. So it's later than Eusebius and Origen?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, that's not the standard view.
Clementine homilies and recognitions are later. The places where you will find that stuff about James.
Okay. No, again, I'm afraid I have to go with the standard view here among scholars.
I am stating the standard view.
I think there are very good arguments.
Homilies and recognitions
in the second century.
Okay.
It contains material directly contradictory of Acts unlikely to have been created by a later Christian. Its contradictions of Acts and the role of Paul and James's death in the pseudo-Clementine literature suggests to me that it was not created by some Christian who's familiar with the book of Acts, because it so flatly contradicts the book of Acts. The pseudo-Clementine literature is not written. In fact, the pseudo-Clementine literature probably dates, at least large parts of it, to the 2nd century because it so contradicts Acts. No later Christian is likely to have invented it.
Pseudo-Clementine literature, if you include some of the early stuff like the Kerygma and Petru, but the stuff particularly about James in Clementine homilies and recognitions is later than Origen and later than Eusebius. Okay, 2 more points. The language brother of Jesus and who was called Christ, we can account for as Origen's language, paraphrasing something that he read in Hegesippus, because brother of Jesus he uses in 1017, a commentary on Matthew 10:17, which is earlier than the reference in Contra Celsum. He names Jesus' brothers from that passage, are not his brothers among us, and names them. And he says, these are the brothers of Jesus. And he's the first Christian we know of to use that adelphos with Jesus. So that's his own language. And then who was called Christ? Well, this is in, right, commentary on Matthew 10:17 is, of course, talking about.
So how many distinct interpolations of Josephus were there?
How many what?
Distinct interpolations, separate interpolations of Josephus were there?
2 that I would lay on at the feet of Eusebius.
So what we need are 2 distinct interpolations to read Jesus out of Josephus.
Yes.
And we have to contradict the manuscripts. All of the manuscripts, as you point out, boil down to the one Eusebius used. We have no manuscript evidence for this no Josephus with no Jesus.
We can't actually show there are any manuscripts not descended from ones copied in Caesarea. Caesarea was the center of production of Christian texts. Eusebius talks about the letter of Constantine, where he's going to produce, I think it was 24 copies of the Bible. Right. Also, we can document that all of the literary tradition of Philo comes out of Caesarea, the scriptorium at Caesarea. So it's not impossible to think that all of our manuscripts of Josephus are descended from manuscripts copied in Caesarea. That's not a long shot. Okay.
No, but
so
it's
brother of Jesus, evidence to who is called Christ, which is in Matthew 3.
You're not a maybe because we only have this.
But you can't show there are these earlier manuscripts. You can't show that any of our manuscripts come from these earlier manuscripts.
That's the problem you have.
No. You're saying my theory can't be right because of all these other manuscripts, which you can't show.
It can't be right, but has the burden of proof because it has no manuscript support.
How would it?
Well,
okay. We do have manuscripts of the antiquities are in the table of content.
How would it?
Content
material non-orthodox or heretical has somehow made it through. But besides, you'd say, how would it? That's not the burden. That's not where the shoe fits. The burden of proof is on the person who's saying, no, there was changed, and changed twice, mind you. That's a heavy burden when we look at the manuscripts and we have no manuscript evidence to suggest that there was a version of Josephus that did not mention Jesus the Christ.
Okay, so
in absence
you're allowing that we have any that weren't copied by Christians.
This is true. The Christians preserved all this stuff through the Middle Ages.
And they accepted Eusebius as an authority.
That's right.
Most of our later quotations of Josephus, or at least of the Testimonium Flavianum, they're in fact quoting Eusebius. They're not actually looking up the original.
In fact, it's the way Eusebius
We have a table of contents from one of the books of the Antiquities where it talks about the total number of years Josephus is covering, and then it says, and Eusebius gives the total number of years as this. So Eusebius has made it into the tradition of the Antiquities.
Absolutely.
Okay. Who is called Christ is, of course, in Matthew 3 times. In Origen's commentary on Matthew, not in the surviving Greek parts, but in the Latin parts, he quotes that. So we can account for brother of Jesus who is called Christ, because brother of Jesus, American language, who is called Christ. We have no record of any non-Christian using that language in antiquity.
It could be, it might be, maybe. Not a, this is why it must be, this is why it suggests it should be, this is why it's more likely than. I need a positive reason to believe this, not a, this might have been worded this way, this might have been this way, it might be that. The burden of proof requires more than that. The burden of proof requires an absolutely positive, affirmative reason. Substantial evidence.
Okay, James.
Yes.
Give your 10 minutes final argument, concluding argument.
I think I've basically covered it. I see no real affirmative reason in the first instance to believe that it was so interpolated that there was no Jesus at all in Josephus. Quite the opposite. In Antiquities, we have two references. The Slavonic edition, although may be a bit interpolated, without getting into that, there may be it may be, as Eisler argued, the Eastern edition that Josephus tells us of the Jewish wars, and it may well have had a reference to Jesus in it. Perhaps different, perhaps interpolated, but I see no reason to doubt that Josephus mentioned Jesus. Affirmative reason, positive reason, and that's what's required here. Not a, this might have been worded differently, this might have been interpolated here and then interpolated there. I need actual evidence. I would need a manuscript, a text, a reference to such a text, or at least some, a linguistic reason that is conclusive.
Would linguistic reason ever be conclusive for you? I'm beginning to suspect not.
Well, sometimes linguistic, let me give you a simple one. If I use the word groovy today, and language changes a lot faster now over time than it did in the past. But if I use the word groovy today, I'm writing at or after the 1960s. And there are cases in which we can refer to a historical event or some idiomatic use and say, oh, well, this sounds like it was in this time, or this referred to this event in history. I know of no such thing that requires us to read Jesus out of Josephus.
That's because you're willing to say anytime Eusebius uses language, he copied Eusebius.
He might have.
Or if somebody in the 19th century had used groovy, we found that in a 19th century work, you'd say, well, maybe the 60s people got it from the single.
Well, we do have a lot more
19th century. Okay. So, have you finished here?
Yeah, I am done. It's all yours. And this has been great, Ken.
So I want to make a comment on the burden of proof. There's a famous essay on by Hausmann, the poet and classicist. The essay is called "The Application of Thought to Textual Criticism." And he says, believing that what's in our manuscripts is necessarily true is to believe that an incompetent editor is the darling of providence, that God has made sure the manuscripts didn't change because otherwise we wouldn't be able to do our jobs, right? And so I think James Valliant, not James the brother of Jesus, what he's essentially done is place the burden of proof beyond anything that could be met, okay? He's saying that, scribes copied down exactly what was there all the time. We know this is not true. We know they made changes. And yes, there's a burden of proof that has to be met. And I think I have done that. Just about everyone thinks the Testimonium is about partially interpolated. James has increasingly shifted towards thinking, no, it hasn't, because he realized once you say it's partially interpolated, you've given up a large part of the argument for arguing that any of it is authentic. Once you say there's an interpolator at work there, you're admitting every manuscript has those interpolations. They're there. Right?
Well, even if I believe it was interpolated, all I need is one enhancement around the time of Eusebius. And that's basically what's argued by, and has been traditionally, the consensus view of scholars, that it was interpolated, enhanced around the time. Now, what I need, you're absolutely right. ancient documents are certainly not preserved with accuracy. Our evidence of the manuscripts constantly shows that they're being copied. There's all kinds of little errors constantly everywhere. To think that there's not big fat interpolations too would be a terrible assumption. We know that the Christians must have added, removed, killed things that were inconvenient, created, forged whole correspondences between Paul and Seneca. There are all kinds of frauds, Christian frauds. There's all kinds of interpolation of ancient documents. There's all kinds of inaccuracies in the transmission of ancient documents. However, for me to believe in any specific such thing, I need positive, affirmative, specific reason.
And Paradoxon Ergon Poietes doesn't do it. Teacher of Human Beings doesn't do it. Tribe of Christians doesn't do it. That the tribe of Christians accept the truth taught by Jesus doesn't do it. That Jesus fulfilled prophecy by being a maker of miraculous works, a teacher of men who received the truth with pleasure, and that he would win over both many of the Jews, which other Jewish prophets had done, and many of the Gentiles also doesn't do it. That those things, according to Eusebius, were prophesied about Christ. So when we find unique stuff that's in Eusebius that Josephus doesn't say anywhere else, that's not language he uses, and that's not concepts that we know he uses, what you say is, yeah, but Eusebius had read Josephus. Maybe he got those ideas from him.
There are, of course, Josephus scholars, in fact, the current translator of Josephus, who believes that the language is all authentically Josephan. And really, what Mason.
No.
Mason believes that. Jacob, am I correct on this? You've interviewed him.
He thinks it was he does think it was modified, but when I spoke to him
he
in the
agrees
talk,
with me on Paradoxon Ergon Poietes, and he agrees on Types of Christian.
There, right?
But all he told me in the interview I did with him is that was the Christ isn't perfectly Christian, like the way that was phrased.
Someone like Mason can believe that was the Christ isn't a Christian way.
And that's because he's read Josephus and he thinks, well, I can see how Josephus said that, but he isn't really comparing it to Eusebius.
Well,
he's not looking at book 2 of the Demonstratio and seeing what Eusebius is doing with Christians as a distinct nation.
Frankly, if Eusebius had really made this up, or even if Eusebius's teacher had made this up, I would have expected Eusebius to use it quite more extensively. But in any event,
3 times is not enough for you.
Again, it's only up. In other words, Eusebius could have been totally influenced by this passage that he uses in 3 different works. In other words, the causal argument can go exactly the other way around.
Not equally well is what I'd say.
Well, I say why not? There are those, for example, who argue that the modified Testimonium used Luke. There are those today who argue that Luke Acts used Josephus.
And I would agree with
it would be a strange world. Why don't we cut out the middleman here? And isn't it a little easier to say that, no, in fact, the Gospels are simply using Josephus?
I think Luke Acts may well have been.
And
I don't think they're using the
thing, right? Luke uses Josephus, and then language in Luke is used to modify Josephus.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
That's an interesting double step there, 2-step, that maybe a epistemological razor could slice off. Why don't we just say that Eusebius was impressed by Luke's use of Josephus? Real simple answer.
The similarity I would say that we have is the Testimonium Flavianum somewhat resembles the epitomes of Jesus' career given at the end of Luke and then in Acts. It's a Christian creedal statement in the same way that those are. But yes, the idea that the second historian of Christianity was uninfluenced by the first, I think, is a non-starter. Of course, Eusebius has read Luke and Acts.
Right, very clearly.
but the specific language I've pointed to is not in Luke, and it's not in Josephus elsewhere than the Testimonium Flavianum.
but it's still, that only makes it more intriguing to me. That actually augments the intriguing nature of it. So what we're saying is that for independent, non-Christian reasons, Luke should use Josephus, and that for his own independent reasons, Luke should be used to again now modify Josephus. Isn't that a strange coincidence?
No, it's not a coincidence. It's an intentional act.
And so they know that. So what you're saying is that Eusebius or whoever interpolated knew that Luke used Josephus.
No.
Oh, then it's a strange coincidence.
How is it a coincidence?
Well, you see, whoever's modifying it with using Luke doesn't realize that Luke himself had used Josephus.
That's right.
That's right. That's just a strange coincidence.
It's not particularly strange.
Well, why not?
Historians read their predecessors. It's not an unusual thing.
Else. Why
Sorry?
Luke in particular?
Why what?
Why Luke in particular? I mean, Luke, for example, in the beginning of Acts, seems to rely a great deal on Josephine history. And so why would it be Luke that they would particularly mine for this? Now, the James passage has been...
Wait, stop.
Matthew.
Who are they you're talking about?
No, it's just a strange thing that unbeknownst to the people using Luke to modify Josephus, Josephus was a source of Luke.
No, people aren't using, well, at least I'm not arguing that people are using Luke to modify Josephus.
Okay.
I'm arguing that Eusebius has been influenced by the first historian of Christianity. Okay, there's been a general influence of Luke on Eusebius. Right? He talks about Luke extensively.
Yeah, it's very important to the author of the History Ecclesiastica. Yeah. So the fact is that, if what we're doing here is saying that Eusebius doesn't know that Luke was mining Josephus, but is himself using Luke in such a way, then it would be an odd coincidence. But if you're saying that Luke's language had no influence on Eusebius's modification of the Testimonium, then of course there's no connection.
No, I'm saying there's language in the Testimonium that Eusebius could not have gotten from Luke because it's not there. It's peculiar among Christians.
Well, I got that part.
Eusebius.
That part of it. There's non-Lucan influence. I got that part of it. But that's not sufficient to answer the question here, is it?
Could you put the question in like 2 sentences?
Right. Let me ask it this way. Was anything in Luke used to help modify the Testimonium?
Well,
other stuff.
I would say write the test or compose the Testimonium. Well, I think Eusebius has to be drawing his concept of Jesus' career from all of the 4 Gospels in general, right? That's pretty obvious, at least to me.
Yeah, he's got all 4 Gospels,
right?
But because of his own historical focus, he is using Acts a lot.
Sure, he's using Acts a lot, and very likely when he thinks of what should a summary of Jesus' career sound like, he might look at those summaries of Jesus' career that are given in Acts or in Emmaus in Luke 24, the Emmaus passage.
Okay, Ken, your 10 minutes conclusion is finished. I thank both of you for joining me today.
But I like the discussion format we've had here. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you, Ken, very much for this. It's always thought-provoking to hear you. And as you say, knowing these things with certainty when we've got fragmentary ancient sources is quite a tall order. So I think we have to be understanding of differences of opinion about these things. And you are always a fascinating person to listen to and read. So thank you, Ken, for this, what I hope was more of a conversation.
Thanks. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I thank everybody's participation in the live chat. Oh, I'm sorry, Kim, what was that?
Thanks to both of you.
Thank you. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.